Okay. So today, as I said, I want to finish up the introduction to the Psalms just to get you familiar with some key features when you study the Psalms so that you will understand, be able to see certain things that a lot of times pastors aren't aware of when it comes to the Psalms. And one of those areas that is the case is in the titles. Now, we've already discussed, and as we've looked at the Psalms, again, poetry in general, we've discussed this exegetical process. And our focus now is turning to the poetic analysis, that fourth step, where we now focus our attention on the passage. And when it comes to Psalms, that's really where the process starts for our exegesis in poetry, because with the Psalms, as we've talked about, we don't have a book that we don't study the whole book of Psalms first because it's not like any other book. So we actually begin our analysis of the individual psalm itself because each psalm is independent. It has its own background, its own setting, its own purpose. There are several different authors. So it's not just one author for all the psalms, but there's a number of authors for the psalms. So really, when we're studying a psalm, step 4 is really step 1. And so, Lord willing, this morning we'll get to the details of that step. But before we do, I wanted to finish our discussion of introducing the Psalms because it's such an important book and because it's unique with the other books. I've been trying to give you some insights into that particular book. And last week, we discussed the different psalm types that are there. As I mentioned, there are a number of psalm types that have been identified, but I believe this group that we discussed last week of psalms that are praise and thanksgiving, lament psalms, which includes really imprecatory, that's part of the lament psalms. There's the song of ascents. There are wisdom psalms, which focus on specific instruction. There's enthronement psalms, which speak of in reference to God's reign. There are the royal psalms, which are focused on the king, often the Messiah. Then the songs of Zion, which focus on Jerusalem and the temple. And then the Hallel psalms, which were grouped later and are used and read and sung at the feasts, especially Passover. So we focused on these last week. This week, I want to draw our attention to the psalm titles. And if you'll notice, I have to the left on your screen, hopefully you guys see it, Psalm 3. This is the first psalm where we actually see some information given before the psalm. Now, when I talk about psalm title, I'm not referring to the title that the translators give it, okay? So for example, each psalm in this translation, and I think most translations do this. Whoops, how did that happen? For example, Psalm 1, you see this, the righteous and the wicked contrasted. That's the translators, the New American Standard in this case. They put that in. That's their title, okay? Or if we go to the next psalm, Psalm 2. Oops, that's going by book. Change this chapter. Okay. Psalm 2, notice again, the reign of the Lord's anointed. Again, that is the title given by the New American Standard Bible. But when we get to Psalm 3, something different happens. Okay, we have the title here given by the translators. They call it a morning prayer of trust in God. But then notice we have this little statement below that in a different font, actually the same font as the biblical text. You guys see that? A Psalm of David when he fled from Absalom, his son. Now, these words here are actually in the text. They're in the Hebrew text, all right? They're not added by the translators. If I were to show you here, I'll show you the Hebrew Bible, okay? This is, the big 3 here indicates Psalm 3. And that title is actually the first part of the text here. A mitzmor, a Psalm of David, it says, those first couple of words. And so actually, going back to the translation, all of this is in the Hebrew text. But there's a clear difference between this statement and the psalm, right? Notice it says a psalm of David when he fled from Absalom his son. And then all of a sudden we get, oh Lord, how my adversaries have increased. So these are called the psalm titles, all right? Or we would call it a superscription, meaning a title given before the actual psalm. Now, again, this title is different than the title the translators give. The title of the translator is not inspired. It's not part of the text. It's just something that the translators do, right? You see that in all the Bible books, right? They'll have sort of section summaries or chapter summaries. But so that title is not, we're not talking about at all. It's what's below that. Many of the Psalms have these psalm titles. In fact, you'll see here, 116 of the Psalms have a title or a superscript. They have a statement written just before the Psalm that is part of the Hebrew text that usually gives some information that is relevant or connected to the Psalm. By the way, good morning, Sid. Good to see you. Glad you could make it. So here, Psalm 3 is the first psalm in the book of Psalms that we see the superscript or title from in the psalm. And as I said, 116 of the Psalms have titles. So really only 34 of them do not. So most Psalms, over 70% of the Psalms, have this title. We see another title in Psalm 4. Again, there's the translator title. We're not talking about that. But then notice below it, it says, for the choir director on stringed instruments, a psalm of David. And then it jumps into the psalm. David says, answer me when I call, O God of my righteousness. And so notice in these titles, and I'll show you on the right here, Psalm 3, it says a psalm of David. So it gives the author in Psalm 3, and it gives some information. In the case of Psalm 3, it says that David wrote this psalm when he fled from his son Absalom. That's a very helpful piece of information because that gives us some of the background to the psalm. As I said earlier, every psalm has its own background, its own purpose, its own occasion, its own theme, and its own author. And so in Psalm 3, we are told that David wrote this psalm at the time when his son Absalom, remember his son Absalom had formed a coup and took over the government from his father, and David was on the run. You guys remember that, right? Well, this psalm was a poem that David wrote at that very time when he was on the run, when he was fleeing from Absalom. So that gives us the background context of this psalm. We know exactly the occasion that it was written. Okay, that's really helpful information. Psalm 4, we don't get as much information, but what is unique about Psalm 4 is notice in the title, it identifies a musical instruction. You guys see that? For the choir director on stringed instruments. So here we're given the information that this psalm was intended to have musical instruments, stringed instruments to be playing along with the psalm. And in this psalm, we're again told it's a psalm of David. That means that it was written by David. Okay? Now, as I said, there's 116 of the Psalms have these titles. So we are given titles in most of the Psalms, which can be very helpful. Now, the question comes up is this. Many have wondered, are these titles, again, we're speaking of what's in the Hebrew text. We're not talking about the translator titles. Are those titles those superscripts, are they actually part of the text? Are they to be considered as inspired? In other words, did the author of the psalm, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, also write that title? Okay, that's the question I want us to consider, because some would say no, it was information added later. Some would say. Some would say that, well, the author did put it at a later time, or others say, no, somebody else wrote it. In fact, there are a couple of English translations that don't even include it in the Bible, these titles. So the question I would have is, well, should they do that? Is this inspired text intended by the author to be read and understood, or is it not? Is it something else, something added later? Okay. Let me just tell you that the short answer to this is yes, it's inspired. Okay. I'll give you the answer up front. It's part of the Bible. These titles are God-breathed scripture. Okay. And my goal is to show you in the next few minutes why I believe that is the case. Okay. First, and there's a website I want you guys, I'm going to take a short commercial break here and tell you about one of my seminary professors named Dr. Barrick, Dr. William Barrick. He was one of my Hebrew professor, and really excellent teacher. In fact, he has a website that has a lot of great resources that you're going to want to know about and use. So I'm going to show that to you right now, just ahead of time, because otherwise I'll forget. So let me see if I can do this. Let me share. I'll just show you this for a minute, because I think you will find it helpful. Okay. Can you guys see? I've got my internet window open. Can you guys see that? Okay. So I'm going drbarrick.org. Okay. All right. So this is his website. Here's Dr. Barrick right here. He just retired from seminary. He spent almost 20 years in Bangladesh as a missionary. He translated the entire Bible in Bengali, and that was the focus of his work there. He's also a pastor. He came back to the U.S. And taught Hebrew in seminary for a number of years. He knows several old languages, Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic, Akkadian, Ugaritic, German, French, Latin. I think there's another one. I remember one time in class, I was doing an assignment for him, and it was an important grammar issue, and I had the only book that discussed this issue was in German, and I don't know German. Any of you guys know German? Yeah, I can't read German, so I'm looking at this book. I got it from the library, and I go, oh great, it's in German. But I really needed to understand this one part, because another book referenced it and said it, was helpful. So I took it up to Dr. Barrick, and I said, do you know German? And he said, yeah, let me take a look. So he just grabbed the book and he starts reading it, sight reading it. Oh yeah, and he read it all for me, just right on the spot. Anyway, I was pretty impressed. So he really is really good with language. Now notice here, there's several links, several sections under courses, or sorry, teaching. Notice there are several, he's taught through all the Psalms, Ecclesiastes, Leviticus, some of the harder books. And if you go to these, they're actually his Sunday school class lectures in the church. So all of these are the audio and the notes from his Sunday school classes. Really helpful. So if you're looking at Psalm 3, if you wanted to get some information, he laid out, the Psalm. He has a lot of discussion. He talks about Salah, which we discussed before. He has some details about the Psalm and goes through some, it's very helpful. It's not really technical, but it's very helpful information, and gives his outline. And so you're going to want to have this resource, drbarrick.org. There's also other things that he does here. Ecclesiastes, he's got a lot of helpful resources on Ecclesiastes. He taught through as well, so you can get his audio and also his notes from that. And then he's got several papers, publications that he's written. But what's really neat also is he's got his Hebrew. Someday, if you want to take Hebrew, come to this website. He's a really good teacher. And he's got beginning Hebrew that he taught on seminary and some other things. You guys could take Old Testament introduction too, if you want to listen to that. Very interesting. He talks about archaeology, issues with translating the Old Testament, issues with various documents, resources, theories. Really helpful. So drbarrick.org is a website that I want you guys to be aware of, because I am going to reference it a few times going forward. But Dr. Barrick is the one who taught me how to study the Psalms. I took a class on Psalms from him, and so it was very, very helpful. And I bring him up because he is the one that much of this information about the Psalm titles I learned from him. So I wanted to give him credit for teaching me. So when we talk about the Psalm titles, how do we know they are inspired? Well, first, they are authentic. That is, for example, if you compare 2 Samuel 22, and I'll just go there. This is in the book of Samuel, right? So we're in the narrative, book of Samuel. When we get to chapter 22, could I get somebody to read verses 1 and 2 for me? Alan, Pastor Alan, can you read verses 1 and 2 from 2 Samuel 22?
2 Samuel 22, verses 1 to 2. And David spoke the words of this song to the Lord in the day that the Lord delivered him from the hand of all his enemies and from the hand of Saul. He said, the Lord is my rock, my fortress, and my deliverer.
Okay, and then he keeps going in the Psalm. Well, notice if I go to Psalm 18, Alan, I'm going to have you read Psalm 18. I want you to read the title and the first 2 verses. Okay?
The italics says.
Here. No, not. Okay. Don't read translator title. Okay, just start from the title of the superscript of the psalm.
For the choir director, a psalm of David, the servant of the Lord, who spoke to the Lord the words of this song in the day that the Lord delivered him from the hand of all his enemies and from the hand of Saul. And he said, I love you, O Lord, my strength. The Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer, my God, my rock, in whom I take refuge, my shield and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold.
So notice here something very interesting. We have first from 2 Samuel 22, we have part of the narrative in verse 1 describes David spoke the words of this song, and then it goes into the song. Well, Psalm 18 has almost exactly the same information in its title as 2 Samuel 22. If we look at Psalm 18, the superscript adds for the choir director a psalm of David, but notice the rest of it, who spoke to the Lord the words of the song of the day. That's exactly the same as what it says in 2 Samuel 22, verse 1. And then as we look at Psalm 18, it's very, very similar, almost exactly the same as the song that is in 2 Samuel 22. Well, what does this show us? Well, this shows us that if we take 2 Samuel verse 1, 22 verse 1, we would say, if you're looking at 2 Samuel 22, right? You would say, oh, look, this information, it's verse 1. It's definitely part of the inspired text, right? It's part of the book of Samuel. It's just one long scroll, and verse 1 comes right after 2 Samuel 21, verse 22, right? If I go to the Hebrew text, I have 2 Samuel, here's verse 22 of chapter 21, and then chapter 22, verse 1. All right, it's all part, if you were to open the scroll, it would just all be there. All right, so we would not say, well, no, verse 1 shouldn't be a part of it because it's not, you know, it's not the psalm. Well, no, verse 1 is introducing the psalm, but it's inspired. It's inspired text. So in the same way, we go to Psalm 18, it's the same information. And it exactly matches what David said or what was written in 2 Samuel 22. And so we would say that certainly must also be inspired text, right? It's just introducing the psalm, just like 2 Samuel 22, verse 1 is introducing the song. All right, so there's no difference here. It's just with the psalm, each of the psalms are separate and independent. They're not part of a broader book, but that doesn't mean that the title is still not part of the inspired text. It's just information that the author gives right before the psalm, information he feels is important for us to know about the psalm. All right, and so we see here 2 Samuel 22, Psalm 18, it's essentially the same psalm and essentially the same introduction. Okay, there's no difference. All right, the introduction in Psalm 18 essentially matches the introduction in 2 Samuel 22. Okay. Any questions on that? Does that make sense? All right, let's consider another point. What's really interesting about these psalm titles is that they're ancient. That is, there are many expressions, and I'm sure you've noticed this in the Psalms, where you go to a particular psalm and you read, okay, we're ignoring the translation title, but look at the title given in the psalm, Shiggaion of David. What is a Shiggaion? That's weird. Why didn't they just translate it? Well, in the footnote, you'll see this information from the translator. That is dithyrambic rhythm. I have no idea what that is. Or wild, passionate song. But notice it says or. They don't know exactly what it means. Or if you go to Psalm 45, and you'll see this a lot. For the choir director, according to the Shoshanim, well, that sounds like a Hebrew word. Why don't they just put the English word there? Because they're not exactly sure what that word means. Shoshanim is, notice it says, or possibly, here, it says possibly lilies. You guys see that in the corner? It should, here, I'll do this.
Yeah, we can see.
Sorry about that. Yeah, so here, right? Possibly lilies. Well, why did they say possibly? Because they're not exactly sure. So they didn't put according to the lilies because they aren't confident that that's what the word means. All right. Even Salah, right? Salah was left untranslated. That's the Hebrew word because for a long time they weren't exactly sure what that word meant. And you'll see even the next psalm, Psalm 46, set to Alamoth. Okay, what's Alamoth? Notice again, it says possibly for soprano voices. They're not sure. So
archaic words.
Yeah, they're old words, not used a lot. And even in the day of the Greek translation of the Old Testament, right? You remember the Septuagint? That was the Greek translation of the Old Testament about 200 or so years before Jesus, 250 years. Even they did not know the meaning of those words. If you go to the Septuagint, which is here, they aren't, obviously, this is in Greek, but the titles, they're not sure what they exactly mean either. And so they don't translate them either. Even 200 years before Christ, these words were not clear. That tells us something. That tells us that these Psalms likely are written 3,000 years ago. All right. That's evidence that these expressions perhaps were not understood even by the translators of the Septuagint. And they're still a little bit uncertain today, some of those Hebrew words. And so I don't remember how many there are, but you'll see it in most titles. If we were to go through the titles several times, you'll probably see, let me just scan through if there's any others that have this. Yeah, okay, here's according to Mahalath, a maskil of David. Well, why are they putting those Hebrew words in? Why don't they give us the English translation? Well, again, they're not exactly sure. So they put a footnote, what they think it means, okay? And most of the time, they're probably close. I mean, they're probably pretty accurate. We know a lot today, but they still left it. So maskil is really instructive. So when you see maskil, that normally refers to this psalm is intended to be a wisdom psalm, a psalm of instruction. Okay. But yeah, we could scroll through another one, a maskil of David, Psalm 54, Psalm 55, a maskil. Psalm 56, again, according to Jonath Elem Rehokim. Well, that helps us a lot. How many Hebrew speakers do we have here today? Right? It's like a miktam of David. Like, what does that mean? Well, that should really remind us, look, these titles are authentic. They are inspired because even the people translating the Bible 2,000 years ago weren't exactly sure what they meant at that time. So that tells you the words are old. They weren't written by somebody. Here's the point. A lot of people say these titles were added later, like even after the exile, like maybe 400 BC, 500 BC, 300 BC. Well, if that's the case, then certainly the Septuagint translation in 250 BC, they would know what the words mean, right? If those words were added by somebody, in 400 BC, certainly a translator in 250 BC would know what the words mean, right? There's not that much time. But because the translators of the Septuagint didn't know what they meant, that tells us that these words were written a long time earlier. So it gives more evidence that they were written by the original author. Questions on that? So this is just, and you'll have, I think, oftentimes in the translations, I think the New American Standard does this. Let me check. They will often give you a little, some of the words, they'll give you a list of those Hebrew words and tell you what their likely meanings are at the beginning sometimes. So here's some of the examples of that. Okay. So, but all this point, the only point I'm trying to make here is just that these words are old words that tell us that they couldn't have been written more recently, as some would suggest, that they are part of the original psalm by the original author. A third reason to take these titles as inspired text is the accuracy. For example, Psalm 16 says in the title, it is a miktam of David, whatever miktam means. Miktam, again, it says it's likely some kind of a atonement psalm or something like that. But be that as it may, it says that David wrote it. Okay. Now notice That's exactly what Peter says in Acts chapter 2. David says of him, and in this psalm, toward the end, it speaks of the Messiah. You will not allow your Holy One to undergo decay. In your presence is fullness of joy, in your right hand are pleasures forever. Peter quotes that. And he says that David said that. All right. How does he know David said it? Well, one reason is because David's name is in the title as the writer. Okay. There are other examples of this. You go to in the New Testament often. Another example would be Hebrews 90. No, not Hebrews 13. I can't remember. Maybe it's Acts 13. Yeah, it speaks of David here, verse 36. And quoting the psalm, you will not allow your Holy One to undergo decay, the same psalm, Psalm 16. And again, it is referenced as something David wrote. So that tells us that the psalm title is accurate. We have another example in Luke chapter 20. Right? I think that's, is that Jesus speaking in Luke 20? Yeah, Jesus is speaking here. And he says, David himself says in the book of Psalms. So Jesus, referring to Psalm 110, he quotes from Psalm 110, and he said David wrote that. Well, if you go back to Psalm 110, it says it's a Psalm of David. That's in the title. Okay, and you could do this. There are a number of examples like this. Passages in the New Testament that speak of the author of the psalm, and you can see that that reflects what's written in the title of that psalm. Okay, usually it's David. I don't know if any other authors are mentioned. Any other psalm authors are mentioned in the New Testament. Okay, so these psalm titles are accurate, at least as far as when they're referenced in the New Testament. Now, here's something interesting. All right. We've already seen an example of this in 2 Samuel 22, right? Where the psalm, before the song begins, there's this introductory information. Notice, I want you to see something in Habakkuk. There's a psalm in Habakkuk. There's a psalm in Jonah too, right? You guys remember Jonah? Notice, before the psalm, there's an introductory statement. You see that? Jonah prayed to the Lord from the stomach of the fish, and he said, and then he gives the psalm. This is like a psalm title, a superscript that's telling us information about the song. We see that in Habakkuk. And notice, we have one of those funny words there too. Just like in the Psalms. Now, Habakkuk was written around just before the Babylonian exile. So around 600 BC, 610 BC, something like that. But notice here, Habakkuk in this book, he ends with a psalm. Notice Selah is in there. So it has all the features of a psalm. And it has in the title, this title statement, this Shigionoth, a prayer of Habakkuk, the prophet, according to Shigionoth. That's exactly what we see in the psalm superscripts and the psalm titles. But here it's in Habakkuk. So that tells us something very important, guys, on this topic, that the format or the structure of psalms, independent poems that were written, many of them, in part of the structure, would include a title, a superscript, that's a common format. Just like epistles have an introduction, right? Paul the apostle to, right, the church, the saints at Ephesus, grace and peace to you. That was a common epistle formula. Well, in the same way, Psalms have a formula in that they will often have a title or an introduction to the psalm. So this is evidence. Habakkuk is an example that we should then take the titles in this book of Psalms as authentic, as inspired text, because that is the pattern we see outside of the Psalms, right? We see it here in Habakkuk. I showed you an example in Jonah, where there's an introduction. Jonah prayed to the Lord from the stomach of the fish. We saw an example in 2 Samuel, where we had an introduction, which is worded exactly the same as the introduction in Psalm 18. We could go to Isaiah. Is it 38? Yeah, Isaiah 38. We have a psalm written by Isaiah after he recovered from his illness. You remember he prayed for God to save his life, and God showed him a sign by having the shadow go up the wall, up the stairs, go backwards. Well, right after that, it says, a writing of Hezekiah, king of Judah, after his illness and recovery. That's a superscript, because what follows is a psalm. And that's in Isaiah 38. That's not in the book of Psalms. And then if you look on the right, there's a number of other examples of this. We see 2 Samuel 1. All right, here's another psalm. And notice it includes an introduction. David chanted this lament. All right, there's a psalm type, right? Lament over Saul and Jonathan his son, and he told them to teach the sons of Judah the song. And then we have this psalm written in honor of Jonathan. All right, so you can see this pattern. Psalms often have a title. That title is part of the inspired text. We see it in the Psalms, but we also see it outside of the Psalms in other books when a psalm is written. It often has a title. Information that related to the psalm that gives us some of the background of the psalm. And sometimes, as we saw in Habakkuk, there's musical instruction included with it, or not musical, I'm sorry. In this case, some instruction about how it should be read or what kind of poem it is. Now, let me show you some, I'll wait on this. Let me show you something notice at the end of this psalm in Habakkuk, what does the last line of this psalm say? Can you guys see it? For the choir director on the stringed instrument.
The choir director on my string instruments.
Yeah, that's interesting. Why is this at the end and not at the beginning? Just think about that. You don't have to answer right now. In the Psalms, like we saw in Psalm 4, it said for the choir director on stringed instruments. Then it said a Psalm of David. And you'll notice that is the case for most of the Psalms that have that statement for the choir director and then musical instruction. That'll always be included in the superscript. You never see anything at the end of the Psalm. But here in Habakkuk, we see a superscript, information at the beginning of the Psalm, and a subscript, information at the end of the Psalm. That's not part of the Psalm. It's not part of the poem, but it's information, instruction about the poem, either how it should be read or if there should be musical instruments. Habakkuk put it at the end. Keep that in mind. I'm going to come back to that. There's something very interesting about that, all right? But in any case, all I'm trying to do is show you, because of what we see in Psalms that are written outside the book of Psalms, we can see that this kind of instruction, information that is given in the title of the Psalms is part of the Psalm, part of the inspired text. Okay? One other point I want to make is the Hebrew Bible, right? Obviously, these Psalms were first written in Hebrew, correct? The authors were writing in Hebrew, and the people who copied the Hebrew Bible over the years were very, very protective of the Hebrew text and copying it accurately. Maybe sometime I'll talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls with you guys. There's some very interesting things that maybe I'll share with you another time. I don't have time this morning. But what I do want to let you know is that with the Hebrew Bible, if you look at Hebrew text, what you will find is, let me see, maybe I can find an example. I don't have my Hebrew Bible with me here. But the copiers of the Hebrew Bible would basically, they had this very strict approach to copying the Bible. And the Hebrew Bible is laid out in such a way that, let me see if I can pull up an example here. Yeah, here we go. I think this will work. Maybe not. Sorry, guys, give me a minute. I'm trying to pull up an example, a picture of the Hebrew text that will show you what I'm. Okay, maybe that's the best one I can use. Maybe I'll try this one. Okay, sorry. Thank you for your patience. All right. So this is just something I pull off the internet. I don't even know what passage this is. But this is often what they would, the copyists, the Hebrew copyists, they'd be given a text. Now notice, you see all these larger characters in the middle. And then on the side, you see the smaller characters on the right side here. And then there usually would be some on the bottom. Well, these are notes for the copiers to make sure they're copying correctly. These notes would have information about how many times a certain word appeared in the book, or how many letters were to be counted up to that point, or they're just all kinds of information that the copier would use to make sure he copied correctly. Copyright, right? You guys would like these guys. They would copyright. So, but the text in the middle here, they would never touch. They might write things on the right or the bottom. They would never touch the middle. They would only copy exactly what they were given, because this was the inspired text. The stuff on the side and on the bottom was not inspired. That was added by copyists as guides, okay? Why am I bringing this up? Well, because of this reason. Because of the fact that when you go to, so the Hebrew copyists were very particular and exact about copying only the inspired text. So guess what they did with the titles? The titles are part of the inspired text, and they would copy them. The titles were in the middle of, were in the as I showed you, this is the title to the psalm, a miktam of David. All right, that is part of the Hebrew text that was in the center of those scrolls. So that was treated by them as inspired text and copied in that way. It wasn't on the side or the bottom or somebody scribbled it in later. They viewed the titles as exactly as important and inspired as the rest of the poem. I don't know if that made sense or made it more confusing. All I was trying to do is just indicate that the copyists who were very, very careful to only copy the inspired text, they copied those titles because they recognized them to be inspired text. All right. If they didn't, they wouldn't have copied them. They would have been notes on the side. But they viewed them as inspired. So all this is to say, based on all this information, this will be in your notes so you can kind of review that if some of this didn't make sense, is that we can trust the titles to be part of the inspired text of the psalm, that they were given by the author, that he felt was information we needed to understand the background of the psalm or who wrote the psalm, or perhaps some instruction as to how it should be sung or played. All right. Now, any comments or questions on the titles? Yeah, Noor?
Maybe it is the sin of Wycliffe. He did not put the verses there.
Yeah, those are added later.
Yeah, but Wycliffe, he did not add the verse with the title. And most of the title he did not put. Yeah, that is.
Yeah, that's true. And I think that was done because it was recognized when they put the verses in, and that was done, you know, in the medieval times. They recognized that those titles were not part of the poem, like they weren't in the poem, but they were like the introduction to the poem. So they didn't give them a verse number because they technically weren't, you know, part of the theme of the poem. They just gave us some background information to the poem.
Oh,
so
that
yeah,
is
go ahead.
Sin.
What's that?
That is the sin of we do not recognize that.
Yeah, maybe so, but certainly what's interesting, Noor, is though the Hebrew Bible does give them verse numbers.
Yes.
The translations do not.
Yeah.
I believe they should have verse numbers because they're part of the inspired text. But I think the translators were trying to show the distinction between this is just part of the background of the psalm, and here's the actual psalm. But yeah, if you look, for example, oftentimes the Hebrew text, the verse numbers will be different than the English translation.
Yes.
And so you've noticed that, yeah. So here, for example, in Psalm 16, the title, which I've highlighted here in blue, a miktam of David, was part of verse 1.
We can't see that.
You can see that? Here's the verse 1, and then a miktam of David. And then he says, you know, hear, Ael, hear God.
It's not in the wall, Pastor.
What's that?
It's
Oh,
not
sorry, I'm not sharing. Sorry about that. Okay. Now, can you see here? Psalm 16, verse 1, a mitzmor of David. That's the title, but it's part of verse 1 in the Hebrew Bible. And then comes, you know, listen, O God, according to your loving kindness. You know, so that's part of the, or here's preserve. Okay, so they're translating preserve. So here, though, in the translation, they separate out the title and they don't give it a verse number. But in the Hebrew Bible, it's part of the text as far as even the verse number is concerned. So if we go back to like Psalm 18, that long title, if you go to the actual Hebrew Bible, that is verse 1. All of this is that title, and the psalm actually begins. Does it? Oh, shoot. Sorry about that. Facebook, what is that for? So the psalm actually begins when he says, I love you, Lord. Let's see if I can find. Yeah, there's the Salah. So they don't begin the poem actually in the translation. They start verse 1 later, but in the Hebrew text, Hebrew Bible, it's part of verse 1, the title. So yeah, that's a good point, Noor. And I think that supports the way the Hebrew Bible is put together with the verses, supports the idea that these are inspired. Yeah. Now, there's something very, I'm sorry, any other comments or questions about the psalm titles or superscripts? Now, there's something interesting, and this is just a theory, all right? I'm very, I have conviction about the psalm titles. Those are part of the inspired text. They should be translated as scripture. They're God-breathed. Now, there is a theory, though, about the that I brought up before when I talked about Habakkuk. Remember I mentioned in Habakkuk, there is a title, a superscript at the beginning. And then I said, there's also some instructional information at the end of this psalm in Habakkuk. We call that a subscript. It's written after the psalm. Now, you don't see that in the actual psalms. All the information, the instruction is given in the beginning, the superscript, in the title. Now, J.W. Thurtle was, he was a Hebrew scholar from, I think, the mid 1800s, if I remember right. And he was studying the Psalms, and then he noticed passages like this in Habakkuk. And then also he noticed in Isaiah 38, I showed this to you earlier. Isaiah 38, which was a psalm written by Hezekiah. And notice there's information at the beginning, a writing of Hezekiah, king of Judah. And then notice at the end, we will play my songs on stringed instruments. There seems to be perhaps some statement about playing this on an instrument. All right, so again, there seems to be maybe something at the end of the psalm being written here as far as instruction. And then look at this. This is really interesting in Psalm 56. Psalm 56 is written by David, a miktam of David, as is Psalm 55, a maskil of David. And then notice, again, in Psalm 55, we have the choir director on stringed instruments. And then Psalm 56 in the title we have for the choir director, according to Jonath Elemre Hakim. Now, Jonath is likely, you know, the word Jonah, right? You know what the word Jonah means, the name Jonah? Those of you guys that preach from Jonah, what's it mean?
Dove.
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 Dove, right? And so here, notice that the likely translation is the silent dove of those who are far off, or the dove of the distant terebinths. They don't know for sure, but the word dove, they do know. So it's according to the dove of the distant places, something like that. Well, there's nothing mentioned in Psalm 56 about a dove But notice in Psalm 55, there's a reference to a dove. Now, what Thurtle did is he looked at a number of examples and he came up with a theory. He thinks that the musical instruction for the Psalms were intended to be given at the end of the Psalm, not at the beginning. So whenever you see for the choir director, or if there's some kind of musical instruction, he believed that the pattern was like we saw in Habakkuk 3, where the historical information or information about the author is given at the beginning in the superscript, and then any musical instruction is given at the end in the subscript. He believed that that was the normal pattern for Psalms. And what he theorizes is that when the Psalms were copied, that for some reason, later on, the ending of the Psalm actually was merged with the beginning of the next Psalm. So that for the choir director and the strings instruments was actually put with the next Psalm in the title. That whoever, at one point, somebody who arranged the Psalms had mistakenly assumed that all the instruction is given at the beginning of the Psalm. And so you'll see that. Look at the Psalms. There's a pattern. As I said, Psalm 4, it begins, you'll always see for the choir director on the stringed instruments at the beginning of the title. If there's any musical instruction, it's given at the beginning. Just go through the Psalms, you'll see that. For the choir director, for flute accompaniment, again, musical instruction. That's given before the author in the current translation. For the choir director with stringed instruments upon an 8-string lyre. Again, musical instruction, then we see the author's name. A Shigeon of David. All right. For the choir director on the Gatith, again, musical. Now, Thurtle said that information actually should go at the end of the previous psalm. That only the author and the historical background information is at the beginning, like we see in Habakkuk and in Isaiah, and that the musical instruction actually came at the end of the psalm. And so he believed that somewhere along the way, somebody put the musical instruction that came at the end of a psalm, that they put that at the beginning of the next psalm. There's one example.
Pastor Tim, that should go to, for the choir director, if that's the case, this should go to the end of chapter 7.
Psalm 7, yeah.
Psalm 7.
So that Psalm 8 just should begin with a Psalm of David. Same thing in Psalm 9. For a choir director on Muth Laben, that should go with Psalm 8, according to Thurtle's theory. Here's an example I think really is compelling. Psalm 88. Okay, we don't have time to go through the whole psalm. But notice it begins with a song, a psalm of the sons of Korah. And then notice it says for the choir director, according to Mahalath. And then notice it says a maskil of Heman. Well, wait a minute. Who's the author here? Is it the sons of Korah or is it Heman? There's two authors listed here. All right. If you go to Psalm 87, it says a psalm of the sons of Korah, a song. What I think is a possible explanation. Notice a psalm of the sons of Korah, a song. That's the beginning of Psalm 87. The beginning of Psalm 88 is a song, a psalm of the sons of Korah. I think it's an inclusio. That Psalm 87 begins and ends with this same, because that's the same
inclusio
statement.
Yeah.
All right. And then Psalm 88 begins with a maskil of Heman, the Ezrahite. All right, so if we were to see this, this is what I think, according to Thurtle's theory, it would look like. Notice there's a superscript, Psalm 87, a psalm of the sons of Korah, a song, and then here's in the side is the psalm. Okay, I'll just highlight that in blue. And then notice the same exact, if we follow Thurtle's theory, he would say that Psalm 87 should end with this, and then added with the choir director information as well. Okay. And then it makes sense, because then Psalm 88 would begin with, okay, a maskil of Heman, the Ezrahite. Okay, that's a typical superscript, right? The author of the psalm and the type of psalm it is. All right, but currently, if you look on the left, all of this, we have two authors mentioned in the psalm title. That's unusual. I think this is the only one like that. So that's kind of strange, but it would make sense if Thurtle's theory is correct. Now, what does all this mean? Honestly, I just give you this as something to think about. Don't worry about it as far as interpreting the psalm. Don't go into a whole sermon on the choir director and the title of the psalms. Do not preach a sermon on the psalm titles, please. All right. Now, you'll want to refer to the titles when you preach the psalm, because that has background information, but don't get into this whole explanation of whether or not the title, where the, is there a superscript and a subscript? And I'm just giving this to you as sort of something maybe you hadn't thought about or heard of before. And I think there's some merit to this theory from Thurtle. Does it affect the interpretation of the Psalms? No, it would affect Psalm 87, how you interpret who the author is, or Psalm 88. Okay, it could affect just understanding who the author is. Psalm 56, it could affect a little bit, because does that title that refers to the dove, does it go to the end of the psalm before it, or is it part of the beginning of the next psalm? There is a little bit, a few psalms. Psalm 46 would also be affected a little bit, because the sons of Korah set to Alamoth, that's a musical instruction. Does that go to the psalm before or the psalm after? But other than that, it's not a major doctrine that you have to worry about. But I think it's something you guys should be aware of. All right, and something that you should just know about. So as you're studying the Psalms and seeking to understand them, you're aware of this as a potential theory to consider. Again, not significant, and it doesn't change the interpretation of almost all the Psalms, except in a few cases you might have some slight, might affect it, some parts of it just a little bit, okay? But I thought it was interesting, and I think it explains some of these examples. Like, otherwise they don't make a lot of sense. Like Psalm 88 title doesn't make a lot of sense apart from this theory. So that's just bonus, free. That's extra free information, because you have a lot of free stuff in this class. Okay, any comments or questions about that? If it didn't make sense, don't worry about it. I'll have it in the notes. You can kind of look at it there. You can look up online, J.W. Thurtle. You can get a lot of information online that discusses this theory if it's something you're interested in. Any comments or questions? More than you wanted to know about psalm titles, right? Okay, well, I hope this discussion at least opened up things a little bit for you in thinking about these psalm titles. Definitely treat these titles as inspired. Definitely incorporate them in your interpretation of the psalm. They're part of the inspired text. They give helpful information about the psalm. When you read the psalm, you don't feel compelled to also read the title, but you should refer to the title in your preaching of the psalm at some point, because it will give you some information, either the author or could perhaps give some background information. So you're going to want to draw people's attention to it. What I often do when I preach the Psalms is I'll mention, like if the author's given in the introduction, I'll mention that near the beginning as I'm introducing the Psalm. I say, notice here in the title of the Psalm, it says a Psalm of David. So we know David is the author. So I'll just say something like that. Okay. But don't do a whole sermon on, what does the word miktam mean? Let's study these ancient Hebrew words that we're not sure what they mean. Shigayon. Let's talk now. Point number 7, shigayon. What does shigayon mean? Alamos. Okay, don't do that. But if there's information in the title that is helpful to the interpretation of the psalm, point the attention to the congregation to that. I often will read the title when I do read the psalm, because it is inspired text. And if I'm going to read the whole psalm, I read all of it. Okay. But I don't spend a lot of time on the title except for the information it gives for the background of the psalm. For example, Psalm 100. Some of you will have this. I think a few of you have this psalm. A couple of you I've assigned this psalm. Notice in the title, a psalm for thanksgiving. That tells you the purpose of the psalm. So that's definitely something you're going to mention when you preach this psalm. In fact, when I preach Psalm 100, I include the title when I read it. And I'll talk about it a little bit. Okay? We'll talk more about that in a few minutes. But any other comments or questions on psalm titles? Anything we've discussed so far?
How about that, Pastor Team? There's no author given.
For Psalm 100?
Yeah.
Yeah, we don't know who wrote it. There's 30, remember 40, how many was it? 40 something Psalms that are orphan Psalms. I can't remember, 48, something like that. Now, what is interesting, guys, some of the Psalms that don't have the author in the title, we can find other places in the New Testament where the author is given to us. So under the inspiration of the Spirit later, for example, I think in Hebrews 4, is it 4 or 3? Yeah, both. Hebrews 3. Yeah, here it is, Hebrews 4. Notice Hebrews 4. He quotes from Psalm 95. You guys see that? He fixes a certain day, today, sang through David. And then he quotes from Psalm 95. If you go back to Psalm 95, if I remember correctly, there's no title. So there's a few times where a New Testament author will tell us the author of a psalm that wasn't given when the psalm was first written. So Psalm 95 is one example. Now, some of the other Psalms, like Psalm 96, Psalm 98, those are very close to what's written in 1 Chronicles 16, which there David also sung to the Lord as the temple was as the ark was being brought to the temple. And we see several verses in 1 Chronicles 16 that are written exactly the same in Psalm 96 or 98 or 99. So that tells us a clue that David likely is the author of those Psalms as well. Psalm 96, for example. There's no author given here, but what he says in the Psalm, much of it matches exactly what David said in 1 Chronicles 16. So some of the Psalms, we can actually identify the author even when there's not one given in the Psalm title. Psalm 2 is another one. If you go to Psalm 2, there's no author given, right? But this passage is referred to in the New Testament in Acts chapter 4. And notice what Peter says here. He quotes Psalm 2, why do the Gentiles rage? And he said that the Holy Spirit, through the mouth of our father David, said. So again, David wrote Psalm 2. Even though Psalm 2 doesn't have a title. So sometimes we can't actually know who the author is even without the title. Psalm 100 is not the case. It's not, we don't know for sure who wrote it. Likely David, but it's also similar to what the sons of Korah might have written as well. They wrote Psalms like this, but it's okay. In this Psalm, the author, we don't need to know who it was because the occasion of the Psalm is given directly. Okay. Did that answer your question, Michael, or or your observation?
Yes, Pastor Tim.
Yeah.
Definitely. Thank you.
All right. Any other comments or questions? Okay. Well, let's move forward to the process of yeah, let's talk about this a little bit. I think this is important. Okay, brothers. Let me give you a chance to talk a little bit here. I've been the one yakking the whole time here. What do you guys think as far as what would be the importance, significance, or why would it be helpful to study, and we would want to add, right, and preach the Psalms? What do you guys think? What would be some reasons to study and preach the Psalms in particular? What do you guys think?
It is God's word.
Yeah, well, one, it's God's word, right? God breathed, and what did Paul say about all Scripture? Is God breathed? And Paul
Inspired.
said, yeah, he said it's inspired and it's profitable, right? That the man of God may be adequate. You remember that? So that means that if the Psalms are God breathed, and they're inspired, then they are profitable and we should study them. Any other reasons you think?
Instruction for right living.
Yeah, just as Paul said that they're profitable for reproof, for teaching, for correction, for training in righteousness. So they give us instruction in how to live pleasing to the Lord. Okay, what else?
The Psalms offer us ways to rejoice in prayer, to bow in worship, to exalt God for all he does and for all his blessings to us.
Yeah, they are a guide and encouragement to give God praise. And I would add, in the right way. Okay, right? We see a lot of abuses of this today, don't we? I'm going to just worship the Lord how I feel. But just whatever come on me, that's how I'm going to praise God, right? And instead of, we're given guidance and direction in the Psalms of how to give him praise in a way that's honoring to him. So they're a helpful guide to us. And also an encouragement for us to give him praise. Any others?
The Psalms help us recall the goodness of God to his people, Israel.
Very good. They help us recall or remember God's goodness to his people. Yeah, we see that many, many times, right? Even the psalmist declaring that, I will remember the works of the Lord, or God's goodness to us.
Mm-hmm.
Great reason. Any others?
It helps us appreciate more of God's greatness, the greatness of his person, as shown in his works of creation and redemption.
Yeah, you know, we learn actually many of God's attributes we find in the Psalms. They give much instruction about the character of God. Especially Psalms like Psalm 139, Psalm 145 in particular, are rich in the attributes of God and helping us to see who he is. Good. Any other things that come to mind? These are good. Let me just, yeah, go ahead, Michael.
You think Psalm shows us how prayer can take a different or a wide variety of forms, something like that?
Yeah, how to pray when we are happy, sad, concerned, discouraged, thankful. Yeah, in many circumstances in life, they show us how to pray, the variety of prayer and praise, right? How to sing.
Pastor Tim, even when we are angry.
Yeah, there's actually a few Psalms that deal with that too. That's true. They help guide us, you know, when we're dealing with various emotions and various events in life. Yeah, Noor?
Yeah, it is another genre of scripture, different genre, where we look at it in that way, in that perspective.
Yeah, it's poetry, but there's a certain form to it and focus that's unique. There's poetry in a lot of parts of the Bible, but the Psalms in themselves are unique. They're really independent prayers and songs that help guide us and show us how to deal with the various events of life or how we approach God in prayer or in song. They're really rich in instruction and in guidance, direction. I had a few thoughts. Some of these you guys have already mentioned. You added some more I hadn't thought of, which is great. The Psalms are God's word. So if God wrote these poems, if they're God-breathed, then they're important. That's it, period. If God wrote it, then we should study it and teach it. And what's interesting, if you remember Augustine, he was in the fourth or fifth century. He spent an hour every day of his life studying, meditating on the Psalms. He saw them as so important. Interestingly enough, the Dead Sea Scrolls contain more text from the Psalms than any other Old Testament book. So you remember the Dead Sea Scrolls they discovered in the 1940s in some caves near Jerusalem? There were these ancient manuscripts, right? Well, a lot of them had Bible text, but some of them were other commentaries or hymn books, things like that. But of the biblical text that they found, there was more from the Psalms than any other Old Testament book. So those guys, whoever buried those scrolls, that community, thought the Psalms were pretty significant. Many of them were integrated into Jewish culture, like the Hallel Psalms. All right, they became part of the practice in the festivals, that they would sing them as a matter of tradition. So the Jewish culture saw them as very important, even in the days of Christ. The songs of ascent were meant to be sung as the people of Israel would come to Jerusalem during the three festivals. So God had specifically written 15 songs that they were supposed to sing as they were traveling to the Jerusalem during those feasts, particularly the temple. What else did I have? Oh yeah, of the New Testament, you know, and there's different numbers here, but some believe about 360 quotes are in the Old New Testament. Over a third of them are from the Psalms. There's more, Psalms are quoted more than any other book of the Bible in the New Testament. So clearly the New Testament writers were very familiar with the Psalms and included them often in quoting from them as they would write. 1/5 of Paul's Old Testament quotes are from the Psalms. So 20% of Paul's references to the Old Testament, when he quotes from the Old Testament, 20% of them are from the Psalms. That's significant. Jesus quoted more from the Psalms than any other Old Testament book. Now, I'm not meaning to say the Psalms are more important than any other book of the Bible, but what I am saying is certainly that book is significant in the eyes of Paul, in the eyes of the New Testament writers, and in the eyes of Jesus. So if they felt it was important and significant, certainly we should see it that way as well.
Pastor Tim,
yeah.
Observation.
Yes.
Maybe there are lots of quotes in the New Testament because during their sermon or discourse, they always integrate poem or songs. That's why they quoted more on the Psalms.
Yeah, partly I would see that. Also, too, just because the Psalms deal with the very events of life, you know, when you look at the epistles, those are books written to address issues in the church. And oftentimes the issues that the church face are the same issues that the people of God face in the Old Testament. And so the Psalms are unique in that they are specific songs or poems that address a certain situation or issue as well. And so I think, and also many of the Psalms are prophetic. So Jesus quoted a lot from them in that sense, as did the New Testament writers. So there are a lot of reasons I think that they refer to the Psalms.
Pastor Tim, because one of the scenario when the people listening to Jesus expect him to end it with a poem or a song, but he ended it in parable, which makes Jesus different.
Yeah. Yeah, he clearly, I mean, he recognized and knew what to say and when to say it. And oftentimes certain expressions or ideas were expressed in the Psalms when he would speak and bring them up. Sid, can you read this quote from J.C. Ryle? I think this is a good way to end the discussion on the Psalms.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
We have probably little idea how much deep truth is contained in the book of Psalms. No part of the Bible, perhaps, is better known in the letter, and none so little understood in the spirit. We err greatly if we suppose that it is nothing but a record of David's feelings, of David's experience, David's praises, and David's prayers. The hand that held the pen was generally David's, but the subject matter was often something far deeper and higher than the history of the son of Jesse.
Thank you. Yeah, all that Ryle is saying here is that, you know, the Psalms is not just David's personal book of his, you know, troubles in his life, but that actually it represents more than David, right? He authored half of the Psalms, but certainly the Psalms represent you know, dealing with the various issues of life for the believer, for the God's people. And understanding that these are not just poems, about somebody who was discouraged. These are, how do we deal with those times of life when we're discouraged, when we're upset, when we're hurt, when we're happy, angry, I think Sid mentioned. How do you deal with those situations? And the Psalms provide an inspired guide in how others address those particular situations, among many other things, right? Many of the Psalms are prophetic, they're messianic. Many of the Psalms are wisdom Psalms. They give instruction on how to parent, how to, the path of life to follow, how to deal with particular issues in life. And so they are, a very important part of the Bible. They're not the most important part, but they're not the least important either, but they are a significant and helpful part of the Bible. So one of the passages you guys will be teaching on is from the Psalms. And again, if you go to the Canvas there, I think I've showed you guys the link. If you go to where all the information is, all the notes, the videos, the assignments, also at the top of that is the copy of the schedule and then your assigned passages. Did I show that to you guys yet already? I can't remember. You guys seen that? Do you remember it? You want me to show it to you real quick? No comment?
You posted that, Pastor Tim, on Facebook Messenger chat.
Okay. All right. So you guys are familiar with that. I don't need to show you. Each of you, I've assigned a psalm and also a few verses from Proverbs. Those are your two passages from. So this, what we've been talking about, it's going to help you as you study the psalm. So what I'd like to do, I'm just going to take 5 minutes or so, and we'll start. I'll introduce you to the next topic. Before I do that, here's some resources. The Treasury of David, by the way, is something you can access online. Very helpful resource for studying the Psalms. Actually, the only commentary that Spurgeon wrote of all that he did, and he did a lot. He didn't write many commentaries of entire books. So very helpful. It's his insights into each psalm, and then also he includes a number of quotes from others in his day that he had access to and their input on each verse of each psalm. So that's a good resource. You can get it online. It's very helpful. I really, really like that. There's another book, if you can get access to it, I think is a helpful overview of the Psalms, like what they are. We've already talked about much of the background of the Psalms, but it's a helpful resource for you if you can get your hands on it. It's a small book. It's not really technical. It's very readable. So something to consider. All right, so those are some helpful resources on the Psalms. Now, let me just introduce this, and then we'll finish for today. So going back to the process, all right? The first 3 steps we don't do for the Psalms. We start in our study of a Psalm on the 4th step, the poetic analysis. Now, what is that? What does that involve? Well, it will incorporate everything we've talked about to this point, all right? It's going to incorporate, remember way back when we discussed parallelism, when we discussed imagery, when we discussed figurative language, we talked about background context, we've talked about now the psalm titles. All of that now was meant to prepare you for this step, all right? And this step has 5 parts to it, all right? And what I mean by this step is the poetic analysis, that step, all right? There's 5 parts to this that we're going to cover in the next couple of weeks together. And these are the parts you're going to have some assignments on, okay, for your passage to help prepare you to preach your psalm passage. The first step of the poetic analysis is to read and observe the poem, obviously, right? Read. We talk about that a lot. Thankfully, you know, praise God, these Psalms are short. All right. You'll have 6, 7, 8 verses, something like that. So you can read it many, many times. In fact, you really should memorize it. That'd be my encouragement. But read it many times and then make observations. So that's the first step. And we'll give details next week. I'll go through all of these steps. The second is, once you've read the poem, you're very familiar with it, made observations, then identify the setting and the structure of the poem. What that means is basically, what's the background context of the poem and what are the stanzas? Remember, each poem is broken into stanzas. And so that's the structure of the poem. So we'll talk about how to do that. Then you perform parallelism analysis on each verse. So we'll go back to, we'll briefly review that. What is parallelism? And then I'll show you that's part of this poetic analysis process. Then the fourth part to poetic analysis is to identify the imagery and the poetic devices. Okay, so we spent a few weeks on that. So this is the part in the poetic analysis, you do that. And then finally, you summarize each stanza. What seems to be the point in each stanza, the main idea. Okay, and that's the poetic analysis. Those 5 parts. And once you finish that, then we go to do what you've done before. The block diagram, textual observation, the word studies, the resources. Okay, all those steps are the same that we've done before. The poetic analysis is the unique step for poetry. All right, and it's covered in these 5 basic steps. Okay, nothing new here. We've already talked about all of these, as really the first 10 sessions were meant to give you the foundation to prepare you for this particular step. So when we gather together next week, Lord willing, I'll go through the details of this. We'll look at an example together, which, by the way, then I'd like you to read Psalm 128 a few times just to get familiar with it. We're going to use that as our example and go through that together as we go through these steps. Okay? All right, but I'm going to let you go now, unless there's any final comments or questions. Any cries of despair? Anyone want to go into a lament? Anyone have a lament they want to share now? Oh, Lord, psalm titles, oh, Lord, how long must I endure these psalm titles? Anyway.
That's just the title. We endure. How much more the content?
We've learned a lot, Pastor Tim, again. Okay, especially good. those titles that we tend to just
ignore,
pass every time we read of the Psalms. But now we realize it's part of the inspired writings, part of God's word for us today. It's really important. Small details, but very important, especially for preachers like us.
Yeah, they really are. I'm sorry, Michael.
Yeah, I'm just agreeing what Pastor Alex said. It's really beneficial for us to learn that and incorporate that in our preachings. Because we tend to ignore and pass down those small details.
Yeah, they'll often give some helpful insight into the background of the psalm. Not always, and not every psalm has a title, but those that do, that tells us, okay, the author felt there was some information important for us to know as we're reading this psalm. Okay, other psalms, we don't have the title because the psalm itself is all that we need, but sometimes, the titles can be extremely helpful in giving us, oh, this is why he wrote this psalm, or oh, here's the purpose, or here's the circumstance. For example, the Song of Ascents, we know by the title saying Song of Ascent tells us the purpose for that psalm, why it was written. And as we've talked about in this course, knowing the purpose of the writing, why the author wrote, is extremely important to understand the author. So those titles can be very helpful in that regard.
Pastor Tim, it just crossed my mind why we study the Psalms. Because we are commanded to in the New Testament. So sing hymns, psalms, and spiritual songs.
There you go. Yeah, I'll add that to my list there. Yeah, we're commanded to. That's part of the instruction given in the New Testament. All right, good. Any other comments or thoughts before we leave for today?
It might be challenging for us, Pastor Tim, but I think everyone is excited because it adds to our learning how to approach a particular genre in the Bible. It really adds to what we need to learn as we continue exploring the Bible.
Yeah, that's what I mean. I want to give you guys the tools to really approach these, different genres in Scripture with, sometimes we'll talk about detailed or advanced topics, but I think it'll help you overall and give you more confidence that, okay, I know how to handle this psalm. I know what the title's here for. I understand, structure, parallels. I understand all the things the author is doing here to help me understand the psalm. And so I'm trying to help you to see, obviously it's a spirit that's going to guide and direct our understanding at the end, right? But we need to put in our effort and our diligence.
Yeah.
And
that's the challenge.
That's the means the Spirit uses, right? As Paul told Timothy, our theme verse, right? Be diligent to show yourself approved, not being shamed, but handling accurately the word of truth. So that handling.
Thanks also for that website, Pastor Tim, Dr. Barrick's website. It's a wealth of resources for us.
Yeah, check that out when you have some time. I think you'll find it to be very helpful. Helpful resource. All right, brothers. Well, thanks for your perseverance. It's good to see you. Pastor Arn, I'm going to ask you if you could close our time in prayer.